in surprise towards the house in several steps, and I could not take my eyes off my beloved Viceroy as I went. Then there came within the bushes a furious commotion, until a black rodent that had the size and shape of a 2-gallon funnel poked itself out from the bush, seized my Viceroy between incisors long enough to resemble 2 scythes, and dragged his body into the obscurity of branches and heavy leaves. Backing towards the patio had at this point been a series of reflexes in my favor, but my feet could only propel me as fast as my disbelief could give way to the certain urgency it would have taken for me to escape. I finally turned, and already one of these creatures was making its way inside the house, through the inviting entrance of open sliding glass doors I'd neglected to shut. The sight of this gave me the urgent strength I needed to pick up speed and run for those doors. I entered the house, saw the vermin avoid the coffee table and scale over the sofa to the hallway like Viceroy had done in backwards fashion, coming out to my summons not long before. I kept running. In my inept clumsiness, I couldn't avoid the glass coffee table. I fell upon it, its foundation crumbled under my weight, and the glass shattered like 100 beer bottles had been thrown with great force all around and beneath me. I caught sight of my own blood escaping from a multitude of areas on my person and saturating my clothing as I pushed myself up, determined to continue pursuit rather than inspect my wounds. By the time I'd reached the den, my foremost destination of concern, 5 of these vile and monstrous things had already begun their bloodthirsty assault on my wife, tearing her to shreds against her struggles and screams right there on her recliner chair deathbed, and to the point where she already resembled a grisly pile of blood-soaked beef, having gone through a tremendous delicatessen cold-cut shaver before I could even hope to save her. The window behind her was slit open, and another 2 or 3 dog-sized rats made their way through the gaping screen and into the room, unconcerned with my standing there bearing mute witness to this unspeakable calamity. One rat was fiendishly chewing on something red and glistening and an obvious appendage of Helen's, all by itself in the opposite corner of the room like a squirrel happily laboring over a morsel of nut it scored, turning it about in its hands, and I observed from my petrified stance in the doorway that Helen's head had been stolen away too rapidly for me to have seen it happen. The invaders permeated the air with the sounds of feasting, gnawing. It echoed throughout the house. I believe I'd been standing there unable to move for quite a good deal of time. I was like a ghost to these damnable beasts, a distant specter, and I regarded this as I became able to more and more think clearly. As I captured my senses, I remembered my children. I turned about in mad abandon, furiously animate, leaped up the flight of stairs to the kids' rooms in record time, came upon my 3-year-old's room first, kicked open the door, flicked on the light switch. There were no rats. And yet, Terrence was awake and wide-eyed, and he was staring straight at me. "Daddy, no!" "Come on, Terry," I said, racing for his bed, but the closer I got to him, the more frightened he became, and his eyes never left me. My eyes likewise never left him but for a moment when I chanced to look down on my way to his bed, and I noticed my tennis shoes were absent from my feet, as were my socks. My trousers were suddenly non-existent, and my lower torso had been stripped of all clothing. The exposed vastness of hair on my legs stood on end as if responding to electric static in the air. I was stricken with a single thought, a rational supposition, a powerfully sane element of enlightenment in all this madness. This can't be real. Either I'm seriously hallucinating, or I passed out and I'm actually physically catching some Z's out back on the lawn. But there was no time to entertain this thought. Any thoughts? No time for a single goddamn one of them. I snatched Terry into my arms as he kicked and flailed against me as though I was the threat and not the onslaught of rats. Fast as lightning, I carried him from his bedroom, across the upstairs hallway, and into baby Jody's room. I switched on the light. I fell to my knees yet again, as I had a couple of times already that night, and for the final time. In the room there was a chest of drawers, the drawers of clothes having slid fully out and thrown on top of one another over the carpet. The large rats were climbing out of the gaping space where the drawers had been, probably having chewed through the wall behind the furniture piece in no more time than it took me to fetch Terrence. That sight alone wasn't what brought me to my knees. One of the rats was perched with his hind feet atop the curved metal frame at the foot end of Jody's crib, its body elongated and flexing over her, front paws limp in against its body, whiskered snout nostrils collapsing, then expanding like 2 respirator bags. That nose was black. Its ears were not like the other rats. They were more folded over their front and drooping. The tar black hair of its body thinned into noticeable tan color around attenuated legs and feet that receded into dog-like paws the next second, and the thing that before was a rat took a swan dive right into my baby's cradle. Jody wailed, and what emerged from the cradle with my daughter's neck clenched tightly between its jaws was no rat, but Viceroy. It took Jody with it into the doorway to hell that became of the section of dresser that once harbored drawers, into the wall. I wanted to follow after him. Then I did not know what to do. Again, I noticed the rats were oblivious to my presence, for they still could have attacked me, as vulnerable as I was, at any time. For a mere mortal, fragile man, engaged in a foiled and useless attempt to rescue his wife and children, I knew I was as easy prey as any of them. It was as if my house was on fire, and the flames overtook everyone else, yet did not harm me. I began to hallucinate again, as I can describe it, if that was indeed what I was doing. I was somehow suddenly out of place. I was oddly overwhelmed with hunger. I couldn't see at first, like I blacked out and had come to in a heartbeat, and I experienced the sensation of biting down on something, writhing and struggling in my mouth between my jaws, keeping whatever it was forcefully at bay, as it fought to live, tearing away at it as ravenously as I would the barbecued ribs of an all-you-can-eat restaurant parlor after getting stoned out of my mind. But as I returned to the immediate events surrounding me, my vision focused onto the sight of my poor son Terrence, sprawled out before me with his midsection imploded like he'd swallowed a hand grenade which detonated from his insides out. Blood and carnage like an animal carcass, freshly slaughtered and split from throat to groin, spilled over and about me, and I realized that I myself had been feeding on him, possibly for quite some time. I lost consciousness after this, not long after, and I knew this for certain as well as everything else I'd experienced that night, that I had succumbed to a deep sleep and that it was for me. Except I distinctly remember in the midst of that void of tranquil black, a young police cadet returning his perplexed gaze down upon me and replying to someone else as if there were others around him I did not see. And he said to this unseen person, "I don't know, looks like a rat to me." Here I am several weeks or months later, I do not know, describing my account to you in detail, halfway across the country away from what was once my home. You wouldn't believe what I've been through since. The men in white coats, the men in blue coats, the men in suit coats endlessly questioning me and clicking their ballpoint pens, keeping me contained in this 12 by 12 metal cell most of the hours of each day until they come to a decision they can all agree upon as to what to do with me. You won't believe this either. You remember the incident in California where that average Joe family guy went suddenly psycho and ripped his family to shreds with his bare hands? It was in all the papers. The media lapped it up. That was me. And I know clear as day there was a cover-up on the part of the police, the government, the great institution responsible for regulating everything we know, a sensational exchange of misinformation to rival even the Roswell alien aftermath, executed somewhere between the time I'd eaten my son and the time of my writing this confession of sorts. On one hand, Dateline's now famous television segment brought up strong arguments but shaky evidence regarding their story about the growing myth of a colony of were-rats wandering from house to house in West Coast United States suburbia, increasing their number and leaving numerous families dead and dying and devastated in their wake. Their case in point was my own infamous tragedy. But if you ask me, my personal opinion of this entire ordeal is that the neighbor's kids had spiked my beer.
Nice.
This particular